You've heard the names, right? Black Thursday, Black Monday, the dot-com bust, the Great Recession. These aren't just, dates you memorize for a history test. They're financial earthquakes. They literally reshaped our world. But here's a thought. What if these massive, chaotic events aren't so random after all? What if there's a kind of recipe for disaster? Well, today, we're going to break it down and find out exactly what those ingredients are.
I mean, it's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? One minute, everything's going up, the market's on fire, and the next, Pam, the floor just completely gives way. It feels like total, unpredictable chaos. But is it?
Because, and this is the fascinating part, when you really dig in and look closely at the biggest crashes in history, you start to see these patterns, the same fatal flaws popping up over and over again. So think of this as a bit of a detective mission. We're going to uncover the secret ingredients that make up a market crash.
All right, so our first stop is the United States. And honestly, it gives us a whole century of just incredible examples. And the running theme here? It's pretty simple. Financial innovation that just sprints miles ahead of our ability to actually regulate it or even understand it.
Now, you gotta understand, this quote wasn't from some random guy on the street. This was Irving Fisher, one of the most famous economists on the planet at the time, and he said this just weeks before the great crash of 1929. It just perfectly captures that seductive story of the Roaring '20s, right? This widespread belief that, hey, new technology has changed everything, the old rules of investing just don't apply anymore.
And then this. This is the consequence. A drop of 89%. Between 1929 and 1932, the Dow was just, well, it was virtually wiped out. That permanently high plateau we talked about, turns out it was the edge of a cliff. It's just such a brutal reminder that when absolutely everyone agrees that a market can only go up, it's probably about to do the exact opposite.
Okay, so here's the crucial thing to get. Leverage, borrowed money, is always a key ingredient. It's just that its disguise changes over time. Back in 1929, it was pretty simple. Margin loans for everyday folks. But by 2008, whoa, it was this complex monster hidden deep in the financial plumbing, These things called derivatives that let banks make these colossal hidden bets. It's the same exact problem, just in a much fancier, more dangerous package.
And you see this pattern, this combo of a great story plus a ton of leverage, repeat itself again and again. You had the automated program trading in '87 that created a flash crash. Then in 2000, the story was the internet changes everything, which fueled a bubble and companies with zero profits. And of course, 2008, the housing bubble, supercharged by those crazy unregulated financial products. And the trigger, the pin that popped the bubble every time? Almost always it was the Federal Reserve changing its mind, shifting from easy money to suddenly tightening things up.
Okay, so now let's hop over to Asia, because the script for disaster here is a little bit different. Over here, we often see crises that aren't really homegrown. They're triggered by these massive external shocks, which then lead to some really dramatic and sometimes totally disastrous policy reactions.
And Japan's bubble is the textbook case of a policy-made disaster. It all started in 1985 with something called the Plaza Accord, which made the yen just skyrocket. The government freaked out about a recession, so the Bank of Japan panicked and just flooded the economy with super cheap money. And all that cash had to go somewhere, right? Well, it ignited one of the biggest stock and real estate bubbles in history. I mean, to give you an idea of how crazy it got, at its peak, the land under the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was supposedly worth more than the entire state of California. And then, just as suddenly, the central banks slammed on the brakes, jacked up interest rates, and boom, the whole thing came crashing down.
And what came next wasn't just a normal recession. It was something called a balance sheet recession. And this is a really nasty beast. Think about it. The value of all your assets, your stocks, your house, has completely collapsed. But your debt? That's still there. So what do? What does everyone do? You stop spending, you stop investing, and you just focus on paying down that debt. And when an entire country does that all at once, well, the economy can grind to a halt for a whole generation. That's why they call it Japan's lost decades.
Now, the story of Hong Kong in 1997, man, it reads like a high-stakes financial thriller. You had these speculators who targeted the city's currency, which was pegged to the US dollar. And they used this vicious strategy, this double play. They attacked on two fronts. First, they bet against the currency, trying to break the peg. And at the exact same time, they placed these huge bets that the stock market would fall. The logic was just diabolical. They knew that for Hong Kong to defend its currency, it would have to jack up interest rates so high that it would absolutely guarantee a stock market crash. So either way they played it, the speculators thought they were going to win.
But then,
The plot twist. In a move that absolutely stunned the entire financial world, the Hong Kong government did something no one thought was possible. It took its own massive reserves and became the biggest buyer in its own stock market. It was a direct declaration of war on the speculators. And you know what? It worked. They fought them to a standstill and saved the market. But that victory came at a huge cost. Those super high interest rates still pushed the local economy into a really deep recession.
Okay, for our final case study, let's turn to China, which is a market that really truly plays by its own unique set of rules. I mean, more than anywhere else on Earth, the government's hand isn't just visible. A lot of the time, it's the single most important player on the entire board.
Yeah, to really get a feel for China's market, you have to understand this one key term, zhengci. It translates to something like policy city or policy market. And it basically means it's a market where a sudden policy change, a new regulation, or even just a headline in the official state media can be way more important than an actual economic report. So, guessing what the government's going to do next, that becomes the main event.
And this right here shows that policy city concept perfectly in action. So in 2008, the crash in China was triggered by the global financial crisis, a big external shock, just like in other parts of the world. But 2015, that was a totally different story. That crash was triggered internally. It was regulators themselves suddenly cracking down on a massive, unregulated leverage bubble. So get this, the very policy that was supposed to prevent a crisis ended up being the thing that actually caused it.
And just like the trigger was driven by policy, you bet the response was too. The government put together what everyone started calling the national team. Basically, a big group of state-backed funds. And their orders were simple. Buy stocks, buy them on a massive scale to stop the bleeding. And it worked. But it also just reinforced that core idea of the policy city, that in China, the state has the power to both start and stop a crisis.
Okay, let's take a breath. We've looked at America's innovation-fueled bubbles, Japan's massive policy overreactions, Hong Kong's epic battle with speculators, and China's unique policy city. So now, it's time to bring it all together. Let's lay out the universal, three-step recipe for a market crash.
It really all boils down to three core ingredients. Okay, step one, you need a seductive story. A really compelling narrative that gets everyone convinced that this time is different. The internet changes everything, or real estate never goes down. Then, step two, you add in excessive leverage. Easy money lets people take that great story and make huge, supersized bets on it. And finally, step three, the policy trigger. This is the pin that pops the bubble. The central bank decides to hike interest rates, or a regulator suddenly decides to crack down on all that leverage. And pop. And what's so interesting is that while those three ingredients are pretty much universal, the recipe gets mixed a little differently depending on where you are in the world. So in the US, the dominant flavor is financial innovation just running way ahead of the rules. In Japan, it's a domestic policy overreaction to some kind of external shock. In China, as we saw, the regulators themselves can become the trigger. And for a place like Hong Kong, crises are usually imported from whatever's going on in the global financial system.
So you see, the patterns are there. They're written clearly all throughout history for anyone who wants to look.